The idea of a multiverse, the idea of these realities beyond our own, each only a fraction different, yet those fractional differences being immense in their implications, in how those differences play out over time. The idea of these different realities has fascinated man, particularly in the past few decades, where various pieces of literature, of fiction, of art have been produced in trying to understand or figure out the nature of such a multiverse. Of course, you have your typical stories which explore the idea of a multiverse. For example, you have things like Marvel, and of course, whether it be in the Marvel Cinematic Universe or whether it be in the comics. You also have other pieces of fiction like Invincible, which also explore the idea of a multiverse. There is other pieces of literature, like certain pieces of manga, which may explore the idea of differing realities. For example, in Attack on Titan, which I have talked about extensively on this channel, there is an implication, at least, that there may be a kind of multiverse, or the branching out of different realities, away from the main timeline which the story focuses on. However, what I wanted to focus on was, more so than beyond the fictional representations of such a multiverse, the philosophical implications of, if a multiverse was to be discovered, what would the implications on our worldviews be? And what would be the rather revolutionary implications of the discovery of a multiverse? I think some of the most obvious things to point out here is that the discovery of a multiverse would impact our understandings of reality as it is, and also of the nature of truth, whether it be our conceptions of absolute truth, or whether it be our conceptions of scientific laws or philosophical or logical laws that we think we understand to be absolute. Now, of course, this would affect our religious and scientific conceptions of the world and of reality, like I have mentioned. This would affect, in particular, the scientific and materialistic understandings that we have of reality. We would be forced to question some aspects of these absolute truths, like I mentioned, or at least our conception of it. Because then, in reality, no one reality would be the absolute reality to judge the other realities by. Now, if that sounds like a word salad, what I'm trying to get at is this. The laws that apply to one universe would not necessarily hold true for all of the other universes. Each universe would have different laws of physics and perhaps even different laws of logic, for example, right? The boundaries of what we would consider to be rational and normative may be defied in a multiverse of infinite possibilities being manifested over the course of infinite time and space, and over the course of these vastly different universes and timelines which would play out in, like I mentioned, a supposedly almost infinite multiverse. This would also affect our conceptions of absolute truth, because at least when it comes to our conceptions of absolute truth, we may think of these laws or these principles governing the universe or governing reality. But like I've mentioned, in these different universes, there would be different laws or different principles. And so what would that mean anyways? That category would arguably be rendered obsolete in a sense. I think one possible solution to this would be that there would inevitably be some constants, or some things which would be constant across every single universe, or there would be some things which would still remain absolute across every single universe. So for example, of course, some of the laws of physics, or some of the laws of, let's say, that govern the universe, some of these scientific laws that we have, the nature of them would be different from each universe to another. You can conceive of a universe where perhaps there isn't a gravitational force. You can conceive of a universe, for example, where there wouldn't be something like electricity. You can conceive of a universe where perhaps mass doesn't attract mass. You can conceive of all of these things. But inevitably, there may be some things which would remain constant across every single universe, or some governing laws which would remain true for every single one of them. Of course, though, the obvious implication here is that we would be forced to question, or at least reframe, our understanding of what we normally would have considered to be truths, principles, or facts, quote unquote. Like I mentioned, the physical and material laws of the universe, of biology, even of the human nature and of the human condition would come under question, like some of the aspects of the human condition and of human nature would naturally be different across every single universe. So we would have to question what exactly, the human condition is, what exactly humanity is. An interesting theological implication, or a more broader philosophical implication that I think is necessary to make here as well, is that it would inevitably cement the distinction between the rational and the normative, in the sense that it would inevitably cement that what is rationally possible does not always correlate to what is normatively manifested or what is normatively existent. Because what may exist in one universe will not necessarily exist in another universe. What may be possible to occur according to the laws of the universe in one universe would not occur in another universe. However, that would remain in the category of what is rationally feasible or rationally possible, insofar as, of course, you can conceive of these different universes existing and of different laws governing these different universes, even if those things aren't normatively observable in our universe. And so that distinction between the rational and the normative, which I have discussed in the past, the Ash'ari theologians and the various theologians of Islam, for example, have made that distinction historically. That distinction would be cemented by such an existence if a multiverse were to exist. Insofar as, of course, what would be normatively possible or existent in one universe wouldn't be so in another universe, yet both of those would be rationally possible and they would manifest in reality in either one of these universes. However, perhaps a follow-up question from that would be, what would that distinction even mean in a universe of infinite possibilities, of course? What even would categorize as normatively possible or normatively impossible or normatively, necessary? And what would that do? What would that render the rational category? Because, of course, we typically have the laws of logic. We have systems of logic. Yet, in a multiverse of infinite possibilities, that can just completely go out of the window. There can be universes or specific realities where those systems of logic don't apply. And so many of these principles of laws of logic that we have, whether it be the kind of ancient Greek style of logic or the various other forms of logic, whether it be things like mathematical logic, those things would not necessarily be absolute in the sense that they may exist in our universe, but not necessarily in every single other universe. Perhaps, of course, if a multiverse did exist, we could not possibly fathom the limits of what is possible and what could manifest as a reality or actualize as a given reality. Another important thought that I've had regarding this is that our understandings of the self and the soul would be radically different too. What would one's true self be? Because, of course, in a multiverse of infinite possibilities, and if there are multiple universes where one's self, me, for example, exists, then what would my true self be? Because there's, of course, infinite possibilities in a multiverse. So in every single other universe, there would be even slightly different versions of me. Of course, this is something which is explored in various pieces of fiction. But let's say theoretically there are like 20 universes, and a certain individual has one version of them which is rich, one version of them which is poor, one version of them which is tall, one version of them which is short, one version of them which perhaps is a doctor, another an engineer, one which is a beggar or homeless, one who tragically lost his life early. If you take all of these infinite possibilities that you could have for any one individual, which self would count as the true self? And of course, this would affect even little things that perhaps our culture has subconsciously embraced. Pieces of advice such as just be yourself would be, in a sense, meaningless because, what is your true self exactly? And inevitably, it would also affect our understandings of consciousness and also our understandings of perhaps thoughts and dreams as well. And, these implications may seem far-fetched, but these are inevitably discussions that people will have if a multiverse were to be discovered. For example, when you experience dreams that feel very real? Are you tapping into other realities? Are you tapping into yourselves from other universes, for example? Or, for example, things like deja vu, things like, you experience something that feels very real. Is it a message from another self that has already experienced those things? Of course, these things may seem very far-fetched, like I mentioned, but inevitably they are discussions that people will have if a multiverse were to be discovered. That will also affect our conceptions of free will and predestination alongside our place in reality and in the cosmos. This could quite literally give people great hope and optimism, or it could drive them to depression or nihilism. Knowing that there are multiple versions of you out there somewhere may give a person a sense of hope, in the sense that, at least in another lifetime I was more successful, or at least in another lifetime I achieved my dreams. Yeah, for some people, it may give them a sense of nihilism, because ultimately for them what they do doesn't matter, because they're stuck in this grand tapestry of existence where they aren't even the only version of themselves. They aren't really that unique, or they aren't really special. They're just an insignificant blob in the vast scale of the multiverse. And, those two radically different approaches and radically different conclusions can be taken from the same starting point. And this brings me on to something important, which is that ultimately all forms of knowledge, they are all interlinked, and they all serve to help us form our worldview, our philosophical, metaphysical understandings of the world. And cosmology in particular is important because the implications of cosmology help inform how man views himself, his place in the world, his role, what he's destined to be, quote unquote. And these things have a very important impact on the worldviews that have developed over the course of human history. And this can be demonstrated historically. For example, once upon a time, people of a certain civilization or people in certain parts of the world believed that the Earth is at the center of the universe or solar system. However, this is radically different in its implications to believing, for example, that the Earth is orbiting the Sun, one of many, many planets, part of one of an almost endless amount of galaxies in this universe. The implications of both of those ideas are truly different, and quite radically different, in fact. And they are quite radical in how they affect our worldview and our understanding of the nature of man and his place in existence. If man does discover a multiverse, let's say, who knows what the implications of that will be? If such a thing were to be discovered, if a multiverse were to be discovered, the effects on our worldviews, the effects on our understanding, it will be radical in its effects on how we understand our place in the world, our status, our importance. And this will have very important implications, like I mentioned, that will trickle down into philosophy, into metaphysics, into religion even, etc., etc. And so ultimately we have to understand that, the discovery of such a thing would ultimately have profound impacts, and they would be quite radical in its implications for understanding the world. The best way that I can compare it is to the discovery, or rather to coming to understand that the Earth orbits around the Sun, the movements, for example, away from that the Earth is at the center of the universe, to heliocentrism. From the various developments that have occurred in physics in the past few hundred of years. And it's not just science, right? It's also the fact that these scientific discoveries have philosophical implications for the way that man views himself in the world. This would also bring up a whole other series of debates. For example, should one interfere in the multiverse and try to alter the trajectory of various universes? This is actually an interesting idea which has been discussed or explored in a series that was released by the MCU, which is called What If? And essentially in that, there's this guy called the Watcher, and he watches over these various universes, and he's part of this order where it's essentially a religious order where they observe the multiverse, but they are not supposed to interfere in it. However, the Watcher decides to interfere on numerous occasions, and because of that, he essentially gets in trouble with the order. And I won't give too much spoilers for that if, anybody wants to go watch it. But the interesting point to be taken from that, the interesting motif or kind of dialectic that is implicit in that is between interventionism and sort of this kind of isolationism or abstaining from interfering in the multiverse. And I think there would be good arguments for and against that, obviously, because on the one hand, you could save a universe from destruction, but on the other hand, you can end up causing more destruction by doing something you didn't even realize would be destructive until it plays out. And so, inevitably, I feel that that is a discussion that would come up if a multiverse were to be discovered. You know, heck, there's a kind of similar argument about going into space even, you know, the kind of argument that we shouldn't go out there and explore space because we already have so many problems here, and whatever humanity touches ultimately, you know, gets destroyed, or, you know, we end up causing incredible damage to things we don't even fully understand. And, you know, I could anticipate that there would be an almost religious or theological zeal to such a debate. You know, I anticipate accusations of heresy flying around regarding whether people should choose to intervene or not intervene in a multiverse, like was done in that show that I've mentioned. And furthermore, you know, there would be accusations of complicity in allowing certain universes' timelines to play out. You know, if you had the choice to save a universe from destruction, or to interfere in it and perhaps cause more destruction that you perhaps can't perceive, or in hindsight only you would understand, would you choose to interfere? That's a big question, you know, and it's a tough ask for anybody. And really it's between interfering in a universe, right, and perhaps getting something wrong and you end up destroying a reality, or you end up not interfering and you end up being complicit in some great evil, you know. That would be an interesting dialogue or dialectic that would play out if a multiverse were to be discovered. And of course, this would raise all other kinds of difficulties. Could we even intervene if we wanted to? What would be the limits of such intervention? And of course, there would also be the question of time paradoxes and loops. If we end up accidentally creating a loop or a time paradox, would we end up destroying the fabric of such a universe or such a reality? This is also a question that comes up regarding time travel. Of course, there are things like the grandfather paradox, where if you accidentally, you know, kill your grandfather by traveling back in time, you know, your grandfather couldn't have created you, but that would mean that your grandfather would have existed because you couldn't have gone back in time to kill him in the first place. You know, such questions or such paradoxes inevitably would also play out in the context of a multiverse, but they would also be quite destructive perhaps, or quite heavy, philosophically heavy in their implications, because not only would, you know, one universe be at stake, but a plethora of universes and realities be at stake if something accidentally goes wrong, and the consequences of that would be more catastrophic and destructive than we can imagine. For me personally, I think what would intrigue me the most about a multiverse is if violence and conflict would inevitably remain constants of the human condition. There's an interesting quote from that What If series that I mentioned from the good Infinity Ultron. Long story short, this character basically, one of the versions of him almost destroys the multiverse, right? But there's also a good version of him that helps out the main characters in the end. There's a really powerful quote, though, that this character said, which is that there is no peace without life, but there is no life without conflict. This is from season 3, episode 7. And of course, that is an incredibly powerful quote in its implications, in that, you know, there can be no peace without life because the absence of life isn't peaceful. It's just the absence of consciousness. Peace can only be achieved through a conscious effort not to engage in conflict. However, the great contradiction and paradox of reality is that there will always be conflict, and there is always some degree of conflict. You know, mankind is capable of achieving peace. Mankind is capable of escaping the cycle of violence, yet for one reason or another, it seems unable to do so. And so could there be a reality? Could there be a universe where violence and conflict cease? Or is this an inevitable yet unfortunate constant in the human condition? That would be my question of whether peace could truly exist, or whether violence could cease truly in a multiverse of endless possibilities, or whether it would be a constant across every single universe.